Morning, everyone. Just a reminder that if you are law enforcement, I do need you to have your camera on so I can collect that information for post credits. And I guess, Angela, if you're ready, we'll go ahead and I'll start with the introductions.
Perfect.
So it's my honor to introduce Angela Weeks. She's retired from the Nampa Police Department in 2020 after serving 26 years. She served the city of Nampa in several different capacities, including patrol, school resource officer, DARE officer, and child abuse investigator. Her last assignment was a corporal in the Crimes Against Persons unit in the investigation division. Angela is a certified FLEC, that's the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, instructor in domestic violence. She is certified by the Idaho Post Peace Officer Standards and Training Academy in the area of domestic violence and sexual assault, as well as for the Idaho Coalition of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. She also is instructed at the International Family Justice Center Conference. She also serves as faculty and with the International Chief of Police Association. So with that, I'm going to let Angela take over and share all of her helpful information with us.
Perfect. Thank you, Tamara. Well, I'm so glad to be here with you guys this morning, even if it has to be virtually. I'm glad that I at least get to see some faces. Sometimes when I do these classes, everybody puts their video on the black screen, so I don't get to see anybody. So I just feel like I'm talking to myself. So at least today I feel a little more interactive. So this morning, I'm going to be talking to you guys about the Idaho Model Risk Assessment tool that was introduced several years ago and is being used by several law enforcement agencies across our state. But as I've traveled, I've learned there are several agencies that aren't familiar with the tool and have not made this part of what their agency has incorporated to serve domestic violence victims. So I'm going to share with you guys today a little bit of the history about this tool, some of the research that supported the factors that are used in the IRAD, which is abbreviation for it, and kind of how it gets implemented. This is a tool that the Nampa Police Department has been using for years. And there are several different risk assessment or lethality models across the country, tools that are being used by law enforcement, that are used by advocacy agencies, but we're specifically going to focus on ours today and talk about how it can benefit your agency, benefit the community when we have a shared language and we understand as a collective whole how dangerous someone is in a domestic violence case. So this tool actually was developed by a state level committee that came together, and there were nonprofit organizations, the Idaho Sheriff's Association, the Chiefs of Police Association, and many nonprofits that came together to look at how we could come up with a more coordinated response to domestic violence and sexual assault, and how we could enhance safety of the victims that we're serving, which is an ultimate goal, right? But also then to think about how we could increase offender accountability and really look at what we could do to increase our collective knowledge of the people that we were working with. So that's what this tool came out of, was this committee working together. When we look at risk assessments, whether it be the IRAD that Idaho uses, or whether it's the LAP that is used, or ODARA, or some of the different ones that are available, there's some real things that stand out when we talk about the usefulness of risk assessments. They're powerful indicators for the dangerousness to a victim and to the public. And I really, really like to emphasize, and also to law enforcement, because when we start looking at the offenders that are killing law enforcement officers, the overlap in those that have a domestic violence history and a strangulation history is significant. So not only is this significant for understanding how dangerous this offender is to the victim, but how dangerous this offender is to the public and to our officers. Risk assessments also allow us to organize our case information and really inform us on the likelihood of escalation in this relationship if we don't intervene and do something differently. Probably one of the most powerful things that I have used this tool for is educating victims of the risk against them. They often don't know, because they've been in this situation, they don't know these different factors. They don't know sometimes how great the risk is against them. And when I can take this risk assessment and I can go through and I fill it out and I turn around and I then use it as an education tool, I explain what the tool is for. I explain why we mark certain things and why we're concerned about them. And then I talk to them about what their own score is. That touchstone of educating them about the risk against them can be pretty powerful. It also allows us to educate everyone along the continuum of the criminal justice system. I remember the very first time I went in to testify for a warrant using this tool. This is before we were doing writing out our own warrants. I was offering oral testimony on a domestic violence case, and I had used the Idaho risk assessment tool for that case. And I was in before the judge, and I remember the prosecutor says, "Detective Weeks, do you have any additional information that the judge needs to be aware of related to community safety?" And I was able to talk about the IRAD and the factors of that IRAD and the score. And the judge set the bond at $1 million in that case after hearing the dangerousness of this offender towards this victim in the community. So it provides that education to people along the continuum, but it also improves consistency in decisions. We also are required, we had a judge over here with our domestic violence court that went through the IRAD training, had the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the probation officer, the victim witness coordinator who were involved in that go through the same training. And then he required that every time we turned in a probable cause affidavit, that we turned in our IRAD with that probable cause affidavit, because he said he was the least informed out of everybody there about this offender. And that tool provided consistency in decision-making based on risk factors. It was a great way to see that tool implemented. It also improves in the agency accountability and a greater degree of care and caution, kind of that risk management system. We know that when we are going to go out and do high-risk search warrants, and when we're going to look at asking for warrants or asking for bond on people, that we kind of do that risk management. This is a tool to do that in domestic violence and sexual assault cases. It also encourages a shared language of risk for everyone along the system. And when I first heard that, I was really kind of skeptical about whether that would kind of catch on. Well, here in Nampa, the police department is not the only ones who utilize this risk assessment. The Nampa Family Justice Center, our advocates are trained. They use the risk assessment. Our sexual assault nurses have gone through the training. They use the risk assessment. Our legal aid attorneys that are on site here, they also use the risk assessment. So it's amazing to me how many times somebody will come and say, "Hey, I'm working with this victim and she's a 6 out of 7 and she's got 3 italicized," where we really all know what that means. And it really has become a shared language. And I appreciate that. So giving you guys a little bit of background about what Idaho was looking at when they developed the factors that we were going to identify and that we were going to use on ours. They looked at some of the national research. Dr. Neil Websdell, if you guys have not read any of his information, he's done some tremendous work in the area of risk. Jacqueline Campbell, developing the first risk assessment models that were out there. There's some research that they looked at from Dr. Philip Rinsick. He actually did a study related to when somebody starts, it came out in one of his studies, but if an offender actually starts moving a weapon around, let's say they have a gun and the risk is escalating now in that residence, and now they're setting the gun out on the nightstand and they're moving it into the bedroom, it actually increases the likelihood of someone to die in that situation. I actually had a victim where it wasn't a gun, but it was a baseball bat that he used on her. And he started care everywhere they went. When he sat down on the couch, when they sit down for dinner, that bat was always right beside him, reminding her of what he was capable of doing. And then just some of the research that came out of Dr. George McLean and Dr. Dean Hawley, along with Gail Strack's research on strangulation. Some of those factors were taken into account. They also looked at some of the Idaho fatalities, which I'm going to touch with you on and just show you how some of these factors were consistently in those cases, as long as some of the cases that made Idaho case law. So in looking at the research from Neil Websdell, Jacqueline Campbell, and then some information from Lisa Bostaff from Boise State University, There were some variables that were consistent in a lot of these relationships that became what kind of starts getting focused on to create the IRAD. The history of domestic violence, that prior police conduct, the obsessive, that when I think about power and control, that morbid jealousy, that, wanting to control every aspect of what they're doing. If there has been a weapon used in a prior incident, if there have been threats to kill if there's been threats with the weapon, if there's been threats of suicide, if there's been threats to harm the children, these are factors that were highlighted as they continued to go through these. And then the serious injury in previous incidents. And when we look at the serious injury, maybe the incident started with assaults where they were punching holes in walls, but they started increasing the severity of the injury and also the frequency. Another one that really stood out was that forced sex upon a partner. And I think this is an area where we really have failed in the past to look at those co-occurring crimes that are occurring in a domestic violence relationship. We get that call, we think we're handling a domestic violence case. So we weren't in the past asking about the sexual assault, asking about the strangulation, asking about vandalisms or stalking or the other co-occurring crimes that are occurring. We know that also attempted strangulation is a high indicator of lethality. I believe it's in Gail Strack's work, they talk about that a victim who's been strangled is 750% more likely to be murdered. The abusive incidents while victim is pregnant. And again, I touched on this a few minutes ago, when we see that increase in severity and the frequency of the abuse, again, these are our red flags. We should be paying more attention to these cases and really looking at what we need to do differently. But that's what went into some of this when we're talking about developing this risk assessment. They looked at some of the offender variables. If the perpetrator was familiar with the use of violence or has access to guns or had a prior criminal history of violence, is the offender using alcohol and drugs? Do they have access to or ownership of guns? And we know this is Idaho. When I train across the country, it's amazing to me how many people I hear don't have guns in their home. We tell them, in Idaho, I don't ask how many guns, or I don't ask if they have a gun. I ask how many guns they have. It's just the nature of our state. So we need to be focusing in on that. Looking at the victim variables, has that victim sent a message to that offender that they are contemplating getting out of that relationship? Have they filed for a protection order? Have they attempted to leave the relationship? Are they recently separated? Have they filed for divorce? Has the victim said that they are afraid that they might die? When we talk to victims and we hear that statement, it's often followed by a victim who's had somebody rehearse their death scene with them, who's potentially put a gun in their mouth and said, I decide whether you live or die. If she's afraid that she might die, she knows that offender better than any of us. We need to be asking for the questions related to that. So outside of those variables, they looked at some of the Idaho fatalities that had taken place right around the time they were working on this, developing the IRAD. And what I really want you to pay attention to is the cases I'm going to talk about are within this short period of time in our state. So May 10th, 2007, Ricky Turner shot his wife. She didn't die, but then he shot and killed his wife's mother and father. And then the wife actually killed Ricky. So when they went back and they reviewed that case, there was, all these things that we were just talking about. There were 6 of these factors present: the history of domestic violence, the prior police contact, the separation, the power and control was there, that obsessive coercive behavior. There were threats to kill, and there were threats of suicide, mental illness that were recent. So red flags that we can articulate and identify as concerns. Officer Lee Newbill was killed on May 19th, that same year in Moscow, Idaho. Crystal Ann Hamilton was at the courthouse and she was shot and killed by Jason, her husband. He killed Officer Lee Newbill. He ran, after he killed them at the courthouse, he ran to a church where he then killed the caretaker, Paul Bear. And when we looked at those cases, or when we looked at that case, again, 5 of the 7 risk factors were present. These are high risk cases. Ricardo Benavides in Meridian, Idaho. Again, we're talking short period of time here in Idaho. He was shot and killed by a Meridian officer after the officer responded to Ricky threatening family with a knife, and he was violating the protection order when he was there. Again, history of domestic violence, prior police contact, separation, threats to kill, the threats of suicide. The red flag warnings were there when we looked back at these cases. Some cases related to some state law, State versus Charbonneau, where a husband shot his wife to death. They reviewed that case. Again, history of domestic violence, prior police contact, separation, threats to harm, that power and control. And I'm willing to bet you guys, as you start thinking about these factors as we go through this, if you're not using this tool and you have a case you've recently been working on, you're going to be able to identify these factors. You're going to know who these people are that are a threat in your community. There was one more from the Idaho case law that they reviewed. It was State versus Jensen, where a wife murdered the husband's new girlfriend. Again, 5 of the 7 factors present. High risk domestic violence cases. Some of the other information that they looked at came from the U.S. Department of Justice study that was conducted over 5 years, where they looked at different things and how they could design a tool for professionals, and what the information was that they would get out of it that could help them assess the likelihood of a escalation, maybe looking at what cases could even help us understand which ones were more likely to result in homicide. So that's just to give you a little bit of history about where Idaho looked, what this team looked at before they made the decision on the 7 factors they were going to focus on for the Idaho risk factors. So they came down to the 7 that we're going to highlight right here. So we're going to break each of these down. And if you've ever looked at the Idaho Risk Assessment Forum, you know that under each one of these, there's additional questions that help you understand, is there a history of domestic violence? When I ask history of domestic violence, what does it mean? On that form, it actually gives you more information. But these are the 7 that are on our tool that we use: the history of domestic violence, the threats to kill the victim or the children, the threats of suicide, the separation, the coercive controlling behavior, and the prior police contact and alcohol and drug abuse. And then under those factors, there are different things that can be marked to create a indication on one factor. So you can't score like 28 on this because we only have 7 factors. So you might end up marking several things on the risk tool that we're using. But if you mark 6 under history of domestic violence, it only counts as 1 because those are all different indicators of a history of domestic violence. There are also, when we look at this tool, you will see that there are 4 that are italicized, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But those italicized factors should give us more pause and concern in those cases. So some of the issues that can come up when we are talking about implementing a risk assessment tool is that the intricacies and the complexity of the dynamics of domestic violence are numerous. And we know that these cases are not black and white. They're not a show up at the house, this is a one-time incident. There's a history of power and control. There's a history of abuse, whether it's been called into law enforcement. It's typically taken place. On average, domestic violence occurs an average, I believe it's 3 to 5 times before law enforcement is ever called in the first place. So then you also have the question that comes up with implementing this tool: who along the criminal justice system and the non-criminal justice system should be conducting these risk assessments? That was one of the questions that we had, because we, as the police department and our persons crimes unit, operate in a family justice center. So how do we share this knowledge? The police department is not always the place where the victims are coming through our door. So who should be assessing this, and how depth should it be? How much information should be shared? Can the police department share our risk assessment with our advocates? And why is it valuable along the continuum that we all understand risk? Some of the other questions: if we're sharing this information along the continuum, well, how are we protecting confidentiality of our victims? Are we informing them that we're sharing this information? One of the things that came up for us is our advocates, we were having victims who had been out with patrol the night before, where we were scheduling follow-up for the victim to come into the Justice Center. But the advocates were saying, well, if the risk assessment has been done, how can we get this information so we're not repeating everything? We're reassessing risk without repeating it. So we actually came up with a waiver that if a victim chooses to have that done, we can share the risk assessment that's done by law enforcement. The victim shares that signs that waiver, and we can share that. And so the advocate can get that information and then build off of that and just do follow up on that without having to start from scratch. So there are ways to do it, but we need to be asking these questions. And how do we ensure the judicial system, who's making the determination on sentencing and bond, and if they're going to be released on a GPS monitor, how do we ensure they're getting that information? We don't want to just use this tool, and put it in our file and never forward it onto the prosecutor or to the judge or the jury. And then another big thing that comes out of this is really the importance of interviewing skill and training for the people who are going to be using this. Because I don't know if you guys have ever had anybody who's had a checklist in front of them and they're talking to you and they just are like a robot going down, asking the questions, marking it off. That's not how you're going to get the best information. It's not how you're going to get the most information. So it's really important that the people who are using this tool are trained and that they have interviewing skills to go through this process with the victims. So in your chat box, I'm hoping you guys all have that open. I am going to ask you guys just to comment in the criminal justice system. Who are some of the players that you think could be seeing this risk assessment? If we're using it and law enforcement's filling out, who else is going to see this? Who could potentially see it? Drop some of those comments in the chat box for me. Fantastic, Andrew. I see this. I see some great, oh, you guys are fantastic. The perpetrators, treatment providers, probation, victim witness coordinators, SANE nurses, you guys are exactly right. And there's a ton of them that, when we start thinking about that, Matthew added some more, the defense attorney, judges. Let's see, we got a couple more in there. Perfect. The domestic violence evaluators. You guys are good. I think you might have got everybody on my list. Oh, wait, dispatchers. That's another one. So the dispatcher, we talked about law enforcement. You guys got the prosecutor, public defender, the judges, the domestic violence coordinators, your domestic violence evaluators, drug, alcohol, and batteries treatment providers, your jail, probation officers, victims comp. So think about how many people just in the criminal justice system alone could really be understanding and benefiting from the information on understanding how dangerous this offender is if we were using this tool. And if we had a shared language related to this tool, it's hard to, if I know, and I've done one of these risk assessments and I know how dangerous an offender is, but I haven't shared that information with the probation officer, then he's getting his piece of the puzzle, he or she's getting their piece of the puzzle, and not knowing what I know, then how can I be mad at them if I'm not sharing with them my information, right? And I can imagine how frustrated they might be with me if they knew I had this information about how dangerous this offender could be to the victim or to the community, and I didn't pass it along to them. So let's take a look at the tool. I know it's a little bit hard to see on the screen, but I hope you guys have all seen this in the past. We used to have, in our agency, we actually used to have a 2-page domestic violence form. This is the domestic violence form that the Nampa Police Department uses. It has the diagrams on it, similar to what it had when we had our prior form. I can write if it was, same thing, if it was a 911 call, if there was medical aid, I had those on my prior form. But what we didn't have was this risk assessment information. So you guys will notice on this form that there are 7 boxes that the header is in red. So you should recognize those as being those 7 factors that I indicated to you that were the factors that this team in our state decided to use on our domestic violence supplement, on our IRAD form. So again, I told you earlier that you could look at these forms And under the history of domestic violence, you might be able to mark 6 boxes under that because there are several things that fall under the history of violence. And when we start going down through that, you'll see the information about strangulation actually falls under that. So again, if I mark, let's say I mark 4 of those items under history of violence, that is still only going to be 1 indicator because we have 7 factors. So under the history of violence, all of those things, now if you mark all of those things, it's incredibly concerning. And I will use that all day long to educate the victim and anybody else that I'm working with, but it only counts as 1 factor. If I go down to a recent separation and I mark loss of employment and recent court action, that still is only 1 point. Even though I marked 2 under that box, I have only marked, or I am only counting 1 under the separation factor. I hope that's making sense to you guys. And I want to point out that you will also see the red italicized. Remember, I was talking to you guys about that there would be some italicized factors that even should increase our concern even further. If there is extreme possessiveness where he's constantly going through her phone, she can't talk to friends, he's always got to know where she's at, he's got her GPS monitoring where he's tracking her. If there's been a recent separation, if there's been attempted strangulation or a rape, whether it's an attempted or completed rape, those are our 4 italicized factors that bring even more concern to this relationship. So up at the top, and this is kind of, sometimes this often gets missed, you will see the boxes to mark what your total score is. So you will see 1 to 3 is what we consider our low risk cases. So let's say I marked 6 items in history of violence, I marked 1 item in alcohol and drug abuse, and I marked 2 items in factor 5. I would only still have a score of 1 to 3. Because again, I only went under the 3 boxes or the 3 factors. The 4 to 5 is our medium risk cases. And then our 6 to 7 is our high risk cases. So if I mark 6 to 7 of those factors, I have a high risk domestic violence case. But you can also mark up there, you can mark the box that says there are italicized factors. So I see the question, where would you put the attempted suffocation? I would tell you I would put that under the strangulation. I believe our code, our Idaho code could stand to be updated a little bit related to strangulation. I believe any obstruction of the airway should fall under that code, but that's where I would be highlighting that at, just to answer that question that popped up in the chat. So let's talk a little bit. So I've showed you that tool. And again, I'm hoping that you guys have seen this tool previously. But I also want to tell you this tool is not the end all be all. When I train officers on using this tool, I tell them, if you mark 1 box under factor 1, you need to write about that in your report. If you mark 6 boxes under factor 1, you need to write about all 6 of those in factor 1. And our officers actually got to the point, I love the way the reports actually developed from this. So you can read a report and you can read all of the different stuff that is happening in that case. And then our officers go down and they break down the risk assessment, and you'll see them write risk assessment factor 1. And then they will write paragraphs related to that. Risk assessment factor 2, none apply. Risk assessment factor 3, and then they'll write whatever applies. So it's really enhanced the quality of our police reports as well, because it shouldn't just be a checkbox. If you mark loss of employment, and I don't know what we're talking about, or you mark recent separation, maybe that recent separation is she packed her bags and she left the relationship. I don't know what that means unless we're writing about it in a police report. So as we look at those risk factors, we need to be asking questions on each of those 7 areas of risk. And we need, another thing about this, that this form allows us to do, I don't know if you guys noticed, it was, the drawings were kind of generic. It allows us to take into account the same-sex relationships. And it provides more information on this supplemental form to the prosecutors and judges when this form is completed and there's a complete report that goes with it, because allows them to make more informed decisions when making determination on conditions of release, whether or not to issue a criminal no contact order, whether a protection order should be dismissed. So again, we can't hold other people in the criminal justice system accountable if we're not sharing the information. And this is the information we should be sharing with them. It allows domestic violence evaluators to use this in their evaluations for the court. It also, again, I talked about this earlier, how this is one of the things that I think is most powerful for me. It allows me to educate the victims of the risk against them. And it allows me to share with them specific concerns. And I'll tell you, I don't do this like on every one of my cases, but there have been times where I have marked almost every box you can mark on these forms. And I have turned it around to the victim, and I will explain to them why we use this tool and what it helps us predict, and what it helps us, how it helps us understand the likelihood of this crime to occur again, or the violence in this relationship to occur again. And then I will tell them what their score is and how significant that is, and that I am concerned that if this relationship does not change, or there is not some intervention, that there's the likelihood that they could die in this situation. And I don't do that lightly. I do it out of concern, and I do it out of the history of the cases that I've worked and the knowledge that I have related to risk assessment. But it's pretty powerful to have a victim get that information and really understand why we are so concerned about the situation they're in. And when it's consistently applied across the process, it can hopefully, again, create that shared language and more consistency in the decisions, where we're not going, well, why did this guy get this? And why did this guy get this? If we provide the best information possible, it should help with the consistency of the decisions that are being made in these cases. So here's another great question that comes up when anytime we're looking at using a lethality tool or a risk of dangerousness tool, is what do we do with this risk assessment? So the team that came up with this, they didn't want to put out a policy. They didn't want to say, this is what you need to do if this, then that, because they know that each agency is different. I might have the ability in my agency to have a detective come out. Some agencies might not have detectives in our state. That their first line is the paramedic, the officer who responds to the scene. They're the detective. They're their own crime scene investigator. So they didn't want to tell them specifically, this is how you are going to do it. But they did want to give some recommendations of things that they could look at when they should be conducting follow-up, different things that should be done with that. And they recognized that each law enforcement agency was going to implement their own policy and their own guidelines for their agency for what works. And the officer reviewing the case should be the one who's making the determination on the next steps based on the established policy that their individual agency creates when they adopt this tool. But here are some of the guidelines. Here are some of the things that they did talk about. So if you have what we consider a low risk, where you have 1 to 3 factors, where at least one item is checked across 3 of those highlighted factor boxes, then it would be standard follow-up procedures on how your agency conducts that with a victim of domestic violence, whether it's, we'll get follow-up photos in 2 days, or we'll reach out or we'll have the prosecutor's office reach out when they get a chance to. If there are 4 to 5 factors, we know that that's increasing risk. Maybe you need to look at having follow-up with that victim within 72 hours. If you have 6 to 7 factors where at least one item was checked across 6 or 7 of those factor boxes, the follow-up might be within a shorter period of time, within that 48-hour time frame. And if you have the italicized factors, those attempted strangulation, the recent separation, the rape, the power and control, where it's that extreme possessiveness, then maybe looking at that follow-up within 24 hours. So let me just give you an example. What NAMPA did is, if we had the 6 or 7, we actually asked our patrol officers to call the on-call detective. Not that necessarily the detective was going to come out, but that they could run over with them. Has a safety plan put in place? Has the suspect been located? Is he in jail? What we wanted to do was kind of assess right then and there what things could be done to keep that victim safe at that moment if that offender was not in custody. Do we need to, make sure where there was extra patrol out there? Do we need to have them staying with somebody else? What things did we need to have a conversation about then and there? So that's just an example of how you can tailor it to your individual agency. So I talked a little bit earlier about how significant it is when you're doing risk assessment that you have people who understand interviewing, that they have interviewing skills, and that they recognize risk assessment is taking a little bit deeper dive than what they're maybe used to doing. The interview should not just focus on the victim's background, but should also hopefully help you establish a history of domestic violence that is often unreported, and determine if the victim thinks the suspect is capable of killing them or their children. So each case of domestic violence is different. I cannot think, even if we have some things that are similar, some similar circumstance, every one of them are so unique, and all of those different unique circumstances can affect the cooperation of those that we're responding with. Location in trying to conduct this risk assessment in the interview should make the victim feel safe and comfortable, because you want them to give you honest answers to these questions that you're going to go over with them. You should communicate the goals of your interview before asking these questions. Talk to them about why we use this tool, and how it will benefit them, how it will benefit the people who are coming along in this process. And you should assure the victim that their concerns and their feelings are an important part of this process. And you might start hearing really how they really experience fear on a different level than what you even were expecting. And you might start getting that history, because we don't want to just focus on that incident that day. Working domestic violence cases is an understanding that this is a pattern of behavior. And if you're going to be doing this interview, you need to be prepared for the fact that you're going to hear stuff outside of just that incident today, and we should not shut that down and keep it from happening. So just some general questions that will help you in doing this risk assessment. When we're talking about just the introduction, what is tell me a little bit about your relationship. Get some information about the length of the relationship. Have there been any recent changes in behavior? Again, we know that there's a concern for that escalation of violence, for the escalation in frequency. Asking questions about methods of communication. I think we all know why that would be important. If we're thinking about evidence, do they mainly text? Do they send stuff over Facebook Messenger? Do they leave recorded messages on the voicemail? Those things could be important for us as we're trying to capture the evidence of what the victim is telling us happens in this situation or in this relationship. What is the victim's version of the most recent event? Again, we don't want to just focus on that. We don't want to shut them down if they start talking about other stuff, but do they feel like there was something that triggered this incident? I filed for a protection order. I told him I wanted a divorce. Though all of those things are going to be critical in just documenting and helping you get information in your risk assessment, but it helps you understand some of the risk around it, and then get the information related to the conflicting or the additional information, the corroborating information, the things that didn't make it into details that didn't make it into official reports. We want to get those things, and we want to share that information. We want to talk about self-defense actions. I tell cops we're really good at justifying our own reasons to use self-defense, but we're not justified or any more justified than the general public in using self-defense. When we start asking victims and understanding self-defense, when I started doing this training for our agency, we saw our assault reports go up significantly, because if somebody is justified in using self-defense, they're justified in using that self-defense against somebody who's either assaulting or battering them generally. That's why we use it as law enforcement. So ask about it. Ask about fear level. Ask about why they responded in a certain way. Why did she slap him when she saw him take off his rings? What did that mean to her? Well, last time he took off his rings and backed me in a corner, he punched me, and he said he took his rings off so it didn't leave a mark. That gives me a lot different perspective on somebody's self-defense actions. Ask about injuries, and don't just ask about what is visible. A sophisticated batterer knows how to hit in places that are hid by the clothes. And sometimes we're often uncomfortable asking about those things. You can have, if they're uncomfortable showing you, but they're telling you that they're injured, you can ask for follow-up treatment. You can ask that they go to the hospital. You can have a crime scene investigator help you with that. And for sure, ask about strangulation, those co-occurring crimes that occur. Talk about the presence of others during the incident. Do we have witnesses? Were there people who were within sight or sound that could help articulate what the victim is expressing to you, and again, give you additional evidence, and understanding whether there were children present. Again, those are going to come into your factors, but we need to be interviewing those children, and we need to be offering them support as well. So let's break it down in looking again at these 7 factors. Think about those, think about that form, think about the 7 boxes with the highlighted red titles above the boxes. The first one is history of domestic violence. So after you get that basic information, you want to ask about the history and the pattern of violence. You want to ask about how often is this happening? Is the abuse changed in pattern or type? Did he used to always batter inside the house, and now it doesn't matter if she's getting in the car or she's at the grocery store, he's hitting her? What is the impact of the abuse on the victim's general level of fear? What is the risk of ongoing future harm to the victim and to the children? We want to ask some specific questions. We want to ask about the abuse and the controlling behaviors. We want to ask questions about, when was the first time this ever happened? When was the most recent time? What is the worst incident you can remember? What I'll tell you, it's not uncommon once we learn to start interviewing this way, that we find other crimes that are still within the statute of limitations that can be investigated, and sometimes additional evidence collected on that we can charge. I have a friend that I train with who says, why would we throw away a good felony? If you've got something additional that you can document, investigate, do it, include it. It creates a better picture for those in the criminal justice system for who we are dealing with. Ask about the physical abuse. Ask about the attempted strangulation by the suspect. And they might not call it strangulation. You're going to hear the word choked more often than you will strangled. Put that word in quotes in your report, and then ask the strangulation questions. Hopefully you've had some strangulation training. If not, I encourage you to jump on the Strangulation Institute website. There's a 30-minute free training that's available just for first responders. There's one for paramedics that gets you some initial training. Has the victim ever previously punched, thrown, hit the victim? Is there a use of weapons? And again, looking at that research that was done by Dr. Philip Rinsick, are they now moving that weapon around? Are they carrying the gun? Are they just, are they putting it on the nightstand? Are they carrying it from room to room? Has there been sexual abuse? We never, ever used to ask this question in domestic violence cases. I don't know if this is true for your agency, but when we started asking about this, and you don't say, has your husband ever raped you? Because that they're probably going to tell you no. They don't want to use that terminology. But when you start asking questions, have they ever pressured you to have sex when you didn't want to? Have they ever threatened you or others sexually? Have they forced you to do things, watch pornography, engage in sexual activity against your will? Even though we all recognize those things as related to sexual assault and sexual abuse and rape, it frames it differently for the victim, and it might create more willingness for them to open up and talk to you about that incident or incidents. So factor 2, prior police contact. Is there a history of criminal violence against the partner or any other family members? And have they been arrested for violent acts? Has the victim ever obtained a protection order? Have they ever had a no contact order? Or is the offender currently on probation? So some different things that you can focus on related to that. When we talk about factor 3 and that recent separation or divorce, again, remember that recently separated is an italicized factor. So it's even more concerning, just like strangulation and sexual assault were. Is there a recent separation, or does the victim intend to separate from the offender? Has she made her plans known? Has he came across some paperwork where she's planning to fly out of state to her family's house and he didn't know about it previously and now he's aware of it? Are they still living together, but the victim has said, I want out of this relationship? Are they separated? Are they living in different homes, but the offender wants to renew the relationship? They don't want this to be over. Has the victim or the offender had an extreme conflict regarding their relationship in the past year? Maybe they've separated multiple times over this last year. So these are some of the different questions that you want to ask when we're talking about recent separation. Factor 4, when we're going to do some questioning related to obsessive, isolating and controlling behavior, here's some great questions to ask. Asking about isolation, and not isolation related just to the related to the abusive event, but isolation based on they don't have anybody that speaks their language. They don't have anybody who they feel is going to be culturally sensitive to their needs. How have they been isolated? Has the offender used their race or their language or their spiritual beliefs to create that isolation? Keeping the victims from going to church, keeping them from having access from their driver's license, knowing what their social security number is so they can get a job. Asking questions about if the offender is monitoring their phone calls or their mail, or are they following them? There's a question that came up: would you include phone calls to the PO regarding behavior of the offender at police contact or just 911 calls? So I kind of think you could do it as either. And some of these questions and some of the factors are not a right or wrong per se that has to fall under this one, but you want to make sure that at least you're including information in your report related to that, if that makes sense. Not allowing a victim to learn English or threatening deportation, being where you are, maybe they brought their family here from Mexico and with the promise that they were going to help them get citizenship or some of these other things, but they don't, because it's a way that they can control them. They threaten the victim. Go ahead and call the police. I'm here legally. The kids are here with me legally. They can be here with me. They're going to deport you. And the victim doesn't know any different. So it's a great way to use that control over someone. They're using that economic abuse of that financial, man, I don't know what accent that was. I was just using the financial control, the denying access to the money or not even knowing how much money they have. Forcing them this says forcing them to beg for money or not allowing the victim to work. The offender doesn't want them to have the ability to leave the relationship. That's what this power and control is about. The emotional abuse, asking them the questions. Does the offender ever call you names? Do they ever make you feel stupid or embarrassed? Do they make fun of your ethnicity or your background or your religion? When you ask some of these questions, you're going to have a better idea of the power and control that goes on in that relationship. But then you're going to also recognize in this factor, again, is another one of those italicized boxes related to that extreme obsessiveness or power and control, basically. Sorry, I thought I had all my phones turned off. I've got one ringing in the background, and it's going to keep ringing because I don't know how to delete it. Sorry about that. So factor 5, threats to kill the victim or the children, intimidation, directing the threats maybe towards the family. I had a case that we worked where he would go down to the pound once a month. And I learned about this from one of the ladies who worked at the shelter with this victim. He'd bring a puppy home from the shelter once a month and he'd set his family down and he would remind them of the rules, his rules for the family, his rules for living, his rules for following the instructions. And while he was doing this with the family, he would step on the puppy's throat in front of them and kill the puppy. He was sending a message to them what he was capable of doing nobody called the police on that. Nobody reported that. And he had extreme control over them with the threats that he would make towards them with what he was doing with them. Getting to the point where they can frighten the victim with a look or a gesture. What does that mean to the victim? What can they describe what that gesture is and what it means? If he looks at them a certain way or clears his throat or does something, what has accompanied that behavior in the past? Has he ever displayed weapons to cause fear? Does he destroy property, clothing? Oftentimes, if they're doing that in the house, you will notice it is not their own property. It's not their own clothing. It's the people he's trying to intimidate or harm. The threats to take the children away, or to leave the children, or to leave the victim and throw them out of the house and not allow them to ever see their kids again. So all of those kinds of questions are great things to fall under the threats to kill the victim or the children. I had a guy who, as we move to this next factor, when we're talking about have they ever made threats of suicide, he'd put a plastic bag over his head in front of the victim, and he put a zip tie around his neck, and he'd start pulling on it. So she would repeatedly beg for him not to kill himself, because she loves him. She doesn't want him to kill himself. She doesn't want him to do this. So have they asked those questions? Have they ever threatened or attempted suicide in the past? Was it a general threat like, I don't want to be here in the world anymore? Or was it, I should get my 22 down and I should drive out to the desert, or I should drive to my grandma's grave? Did they start saying more specific things about what they wanted to do? Did they blame the victim for wanting to commit suicide? Do they have any other mental health issues? Do they suffer from depression? Are they schizophrenic? Are they off of their medication? Are there any recent stressors in their life? Have they recently lost a job, or maybe had debt companies coming after them where they've got some financial stressors? Have there been any recent deaths or any other separations or concerns like that in the family that could be escalating? And then ask the victim, how does she think the recent stress has influenced it? So these are just examples, again, of some questions that can be asked related to all of these factors. There are so many more, and hopefully what happens when we're doing good interviewing, these questions lead to responses that lead us to additional questions to paint a bigger picture of what's going on. So the last one is factor 7, and it's asking about the alcohol and drug abuse. And you want to ask specifically about it if there was, alcohol and drug abuse that day, but you want to also talk about how often are they drinking? How often are they using drugs? Has there been a change in that? Has there been changes in violent behavior related to the alcohol and drugs? We know alcohol and drugs don't cause domestic violence. We know that they lower inhibitions, and sometimes the violence is worse under the influence, but it definitely doesn't cause it. So I have another question for you guys. Get ready in your chat box. So we talked about the application of this risk assessment tool for the criminal justice system. And you guys named a lot of different people that would benefit from knowing how much of a risk this relationship is. How likely is this guy to continue his violent behavior? How likely is it that somebody's going to die if we don't do something? Are there other people that are not in the criminal justice system that you think could benefit from knowing about risk in these relationships? And if so, who? Schools and educators, like advocates and counselors. Those are great responses. One of the ways I ask this question is, who else does this bleed over to? Who else, when we see these mass homicides of these perpetrators who are killing their spouse, their children, who else does this bleed over to? Divorce and civil custody, child custody attorneys, that's a good one. Mental health, employers, guardian ad litem. Good job, you guys. You guys are doing a fantastic job. There is actually a very significant list. When we look at this list, the ER personnel, DV shelters, the advocates, neighbors, what if the neighbor goes over and tries to intervene? The schools, the we see all the time. I was a school resource officer. We saw the products of this violence in the schools. These kids were sleeping because the violence at home didn't let them sleep. There are some considerations as it goes along with looking at those things, right? We have confidentiality issues. We have to ask questions about who do we share this information with? Yeah, there's a lot of people that this would benefit from. Does the victim share, did they sign a waiver for us to share this with anybody? Did we educate them to maybe share what we have educated them on with anybody? Let me give an example. If I have somebody who is having problems with their offender at work, I will often ask them, have they considered telling any of telling their employer, telling any of their coworkers, asking security or anybody to walk them out? Have they shared the information about any of this risk with that person? Because we know anytime we bring somebody else in to help, if we have somebody who is a high risk offender, we're putting other people at risk. But the reality is they're already at risk. Some of them just don't know the potential of that risk. So it's a great conversation to be having. Who do we share this information with? Do we ask, is the victim sharing this information with anybody? And how do we balance that with confidentiality considerations? So those are all questions that we should be having when we're looking at implementing a risk tool, any risk tool. So when we talk about going through those factors, at the end of the interview, that's when you should be completing your supplement. If there are things at the end of your interview that didn't get asked in those boxes, that's when you can go back and say, oh, I noticed one other thing I just wanted to ask a question about. Maybe I forgot to ask, maybe strangulation never came up when I was doing the interview. It should have, but let's say it didn't for the sake of demonstration. So then I would go back and say, oh, I noticed as I'm going through my form, I have one other question I wanted to follow up with you. And then I would ask about that. And then after the interview is when you're going to complete your supplement form and determine your risk factors. That's when you're going to go back up to the top and you're going to say, I have a 1 to 3 score, I have a 4 to 5 score, or I have a 6 to 7 score, or I have italicized factors. And that's when you're going to write what your risk assessment is. That's when you're going to know what your score is. That's going to be your common language. I've got a guy that's a 6 to 7 with 2 italicized. That's where that common language comes from. And it's going to be articulated in your report. So again, we went over some of the stuff from 2007 that the coalition pulled up some of this information from and where they developed our risk tool from. But, let's look at this a little broader. In 2007, Idaho had 22 domestic violence related fatalities, including a law enforcement officer. I talked to you about that, Officer Lee Newbill up in Lewiston at the courthouse. Most of Idaho's fatalities, most of all of them, and I can tell you if we went back and did this with the domestic violence related homicides this year, if we did it last year, most of them had a 5 or higher on the score. We can't predict human behavior, but we can learn from it. And if we learn to use this tool, the IRAD, we might actually save lives. So something for us to consider. That's why we should be looking at risk assessments. This is why we should be looking at what these factors are. That's why we should be taking these forms and asking our agencies to do more training and introducing this to our agencies. Introduce it to your prosecutor, introduce it to your judge, introduce it to your probation officers. Share this information because our victims deserve it. And our offenders need to be held accountable. And the more we can collectively share this information, the more effectively we will do those two things. And that's what we're supposed to be doing. So I want to leave time for questions. And you guys can do this in the chat. You guys can unmute yourself. But as we do that, I'm going to just leave this up here that if you guys don't have the risk assessment form, if you want more information about how you can get training on the risk assessment form, this is just a way that you guys can reach out on it. I recently did some training up in Salmon, Idaho, and I know that they had previously looked at it, but we know how it works. There's turnover in agencies. Maybe somebody was using it, but it hadn't been rolled out across the agency. So if you guys want more information about how to do this, how to get the form, how to get pocket cards for your law enforcement officers, this is a great way for you to do it. So that being said, what questions do you guys have? What comments do you have? Are you guys using this tool? Have you seen any results from it? Crickets.
Yeah, we do use it here at Caldwell Police, and we actually, if we have 4 or more factors checked or any of the lethality factors, then we're calling out a on-call persons crime detective or the on-call detective to take over that investigation and do a domestic violence SANE exam at the hospital on everybody that's willing.
Excellent.
And we've seen that help us just do more thorough investigations, better convictions, higher bonds.
Have you seen it
by
improve
using
your
it.
police reports, Andrew?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, that we saw, that was an unintended, I mean, consequence, I guess, if you will, but it was such a great one. We just didn't expect that, but we saw a significant change, and the prosecutors noted it, right? I'm sure you guys have experienced the same things.
Yeah.
Awesome. Did you have any cases where you've been able to educate your victims with this tool, Andrew?
Yeah, probably most of them. I'm going to start doing it kind of more intentionally, like you suggested, but yeah, when they kind of look at it afterwards and see all the different things they checked and see it on paper, it's kind of alarming to them, like, oh, I didn't realize when I was saying all those things how much that is.
Yeah, you know, and I'll tell you, I never use it as a, you know, hey, look at this score, get out of this relationship. I never use it in that context. I do use it in the context of, I want you to understand how dangerous this relationship is. And I really want you to consider working with advocacy for safety planning. I will never tell somebody to get out of a relationship. I used to do that. I used to think that was the end all be all, but most domestic violence homicides occur at the end of the relationship once the victim has left. So it's better for us to offer safety planning and the victim and really work with the victim on that. If she says, if I leave the house, he will hunt me down and kill me, go with her on that. Work with her on how she can be safe within the house. I never turn that score around and say, you need to leave, because I can't guarantee protection 375, or, you know, 24/7, 365. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
Would you be available for private, like to meet privately sometime?
Absolutely. So I apologize. I just realized I didn't put my email up on there. I'm going to put it in the chat box really quick. And any of you who want to reach out to me for anything, I am happy to help you guys. I mean, this is one thing that I learned as a law enforcement officer, is that more I could learn and share, the more I could learn from other people and then share. Shame on us for not sharing what we know, but I am happy to help you guys with anything. So there is an email that you guys can reach out to me, and we can set up a Zoom meeting. We can, you know, whatever I can help you out with.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you. This is fantastic. Thank you so much.
Great. Okay, I'm reading Stacy's question real quick. Says, an issue I have seen is that law enforcement will not intervene or assist if there are no physical acts of violence. The perpetrator can exhibit nearly all the variables, but there is no physical violence yet. Okay. So one of the things, and I think this is a great kind of way to think about what we're being trained on. So it depends on how much training a law enforcement officer gets. You know, they get stuff in the basic academy, but it's not uncommon that I go and do training where I say, when is the last time you had domestic violence training? Or when is the last time you had sexual assault training? And, you know, they can be a law enforcement officer for 10 years and they'll tell me when I was in my academy. That should not be happening. So what I would encourage is that, and this happened for us, I didn't know what I didn't know. I mean, I've never been an ill-intended officer, but when I was younger in this career, I didn't know what I didn't know. I hadn't had training on certain things. So I had people outside of my profession. I had some advocates who gracefully came alongside me. You know, they didn't say, hey, dumbass, you're doing this wrong, you're endangering victims. But they said, you know, we have this great training that's coming up and we need a law enforcement officer just to give the law enforcement side of this. And I didn't know what I was giving a side of. They wanted to know was like my criminal code and stuff. But what it did is it put me in the training, hearing what they were teaching. And then they were like, hey, do you want to go to this training with us? Do you want to, we're offering this free training. We're providing food, always provide food if you want cops to show up. But it was a great way to bring them alongside, because I can tell you that it's been my experience, especially traveling around the state, that this is not a training that officers repeatedly get. That when we talk about self-defense training, when we talk about understanding assault, when we talk about, because there does not have to be physical violence for you to have a crime. Somebody could have assaulted somebody and they could be cowering in the corner. They could have, walked up and said, you know what, I'm going to bash your head in, and be standing over them ready to punch somebody. And that is an assault. But if we're not trained, if we're not asking the right questions, if we don't know how to look at those things, then it can be overlooked. And then we're not doing the risk assessment. I'm a firm believer that every domestic violence call, whether it's an arrestable offense or not, a report should be generated. I am a firm believer that in every domestic violence call, a risk assessment should be done. We are actually now doing risk assessments at the Nampa Police Department, not on just domestic violence calls, but if there's a civil protection order violation or a no contact order violation, we are doing risk assessments. And because I told you guys the significant connection between offenders and the dangerousness, not only to victims, but those they kill cops, we actually in our report management system can now flag the risk assessment score. So when dispatch is sending officers out, they can pull up the offender and they can give information on that common language and the risk factors, which is crucial for law enforcement to know. We should know who we're dealing with when we go out there. Any other questions or comments? Well, I really appreciate your guys' willingness to jump on here and be part of our virtual world. I am hoping and praying next year we can hug people to see you guys in person. And but if there is anything I can do at all to help, I've got a lot of resource connections to a lot of national resources that I'm always happy to share with people. Video trainings that you guys can get. There's actually some free video trainings on domestic violence that can be used for briefing that the International Association of Chiefs of Police have. I believe there are some on sexual assault as well. You can definitely go onto their website and just kind of Google how you get access to those, and they will send them out. So you can start doing trainings in your own communities too, even if it's just briefing trainings for your agencies. So if there aren't any other questions, Tamara, were there any other questions that I missed as we were going through?
No, I didn't see any. I did put a note that the address for the coalition has changed.
I saw that.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
So just in case you were going to try to get a hold of them. But no, great. I enjoyed the fact that we had some great responses to some of your questions. I did send some chats out to some people that I questioned whether they're wanting to get post credits because they show their camera on, but their screen is black. So they need to reach out to me if they want to get those post credits. So that's all I had.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. That was so great.